tally nates, and I will allow others to come in. So please be patient with us for another 2-3 minutes until everyone comes and join our webinar. Oh, I also see some familiar names. Welcome again to those joining us from South Africa and from around the world. We will give it 1 or 2 more minutes and start at 2 minutes after the hour. As we are letting people in, people are coming in from all around, and I see lovely friends from South Africa and the world, from all around South Africa, joining us. Wonderful to see people from Kimberley and from Johannesburg and Cape Town and all around the world too. All right, it is 2 minutes after the hour. We will continue to admit people, but let us start. We have a lovely full program, and I don't want us to miss anything. My name is Tali Nates. I'm the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and it is wonderful to welcome you to this Zoom event, this Zoom webinar today. We looked so forward to it for a long time, us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. For those that don't know us, this is the building behind me that you see in this background. We are situated in Johannesburg, South Africa. We are a center with exhibitions, but also permanent exhibition, temporary exhibitions, but spaces for study and workshops, conferences, concerts, theaters, film screening, research, publication, and so much more. We are calling ourselves a center of memory, education, dialogue, and lessons for humanity. And with that, we work with many, many partners around the world. And one of our excellent and long-term partner is the University of Leeds and Professor Stuart Taberner. Professor Taberner and us started to work many years ago on different projects, from exhibitions to concerts to conferences to publications, articles, and lectures. And we enjoyed having Stuart with us last year, speaking exactly about this project and what our
Tally, you're freezing. Maybe you should take your video off.
With this project. Sorry, my internet is a little bit unstable. Apologies for that. And with that, I will introduce Professor Stuart Taberner of the University of Leeds, the editor of this compilation. Stuart, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tali. I suspect that my internet might be even more unstable, so hopefully it'll work. So as Tali just mentioned, I'm Stuart Taberner from the University of Leeds. Worked with Tali and the centre for many years, and absolutely loved every minute of it. The work that's being done there is so important, and it's just been a pleasure to be part of that work over a long period of time. I'm here today not in that capacity, but as editor of the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature, which is a volume of around 40 essays that really sets out to trace that history from the very first writing in the ghettos and the camps, right until the contemporary moment with novels and fiction that are still coming out today. And I was in Johannesburg in October and had a very engaged and lively discussion with a group of guests, some of whose names I recognise today as well. So it's a pleasure to see people again. The format today is that we have 3 speakers, and each speaker will speak for about 8 minutes each on their particular topic relating to the overall theme that we're speaking about today. Then there'll be about 10 minutes where I'll try and moderate a conversation, a dialogue between those 3 colleagues, and then we'll open up to questions from everyone afterwards. And please do ask whatever you want. They are experts in their fields, and they'll be delighted to come back with a response to you. I'm going to introduce each colleague in turn just before their 8 minutes, so that you don't have to remember all 3 of them all the way through. So we'll start with Erin McClothlin, who is the Vice Dean of Undergraduate Affairs, the Washington University in St. Louis. Erin is also the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Holocaust Studies and a Professor of German and Jewish Studies. And Erin's main research interests are in Holocaust literature and film and German Jewish literature. Her most recent book is The Mind of the Holocaust Perpetrator in Fiction and Non-Fiction. So Erin, if I could hand over to you for your contribution, and then we will move to our second speaker directly after that.
Thank you, Stuart. Greetings from the Northern Hemisphere to those of you in the Southern Hemisphere. I am going to talk briefly about my contribution to this volume that I serve as co-editor for, the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature. And what I really am working on is thinking about representations of killing centers outside of the Auschwitz context. So in particular, I'm interested in the ways in which the 3 Operation Reinhardt killing centers, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, are mostly absent in the public discourse on the Holocaust and also in Holocaust literature. Auschwitz, as we all know, is kind of the center of our symbolic geography of the Holocaust. Many of the canonical narratives of the Holocaust that we know about, those by Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, they convey what we have come to think about as iconic moments of the Holocaust. And they've contributed to a sort of master narrative of the Holocaust, whereby Auschwitz is seen as the standard or the stand-in for the entirety of the Holocaust, or at least representative of the very worst of the Holocaust. But that idea of Auschwitz as a sort of yardstick for the Holocaust, or the norm of the Holocaust, really reduces our understanding of the complex events of the Holocaust and makes it difficult to recognize the specific character of other experiences. And I think that that's the theme of our panel today. It also displaces from the public imagination important experiences such as mass shootings, ghettoization, hiding and passing, and the experience of other killing centers, particularly these 3 Operation Reinhardt centers, which I'm going to focus on. So these 3 Reinhardt centers, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, were operational for only a very short period of time, from March 1942 to November 1943. But in those 21 months, they were responsible for the murder of nearly 1/3 of the victims of the Holocaust. And in fact, during a single 3-month stretch within that period, so from August to October 1942, nearly 1 million people were murdered in those 3 killing centers. So that's the most intensive killing surge during the whole of the Holocaust. But despite their centrality to the history of the Holocaust, they barely register at all in contemporary consciousness. They're often considered the forgotten concentration camps of the Holocaust. And in fact, in a recent survey undertaken by the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany, a survey of American millennials and Gen Z, 44% of those surveyed were correctly able to identify Auschwitz, and that's a really low figure and quite concerning. But only 1% of the people could identify Treblinka, the place where the killing outpaced that of any other location during the Holocaust. So there's really an absence in the public imagination. And my chapter really starts to trace that. Why is it so that we don't know much about these killing centers? Well, first of all, Auschwitz had more victims than any other killing center, more than 1 million Jews and over 100,000 Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and non-Jews. But it also had a relatively large number of survivors. It was the only killing center to be located at this huge concentration and labor camp complex, which meant that of the 400,000 people who went into Auschwitz and received tattooed numbers, an estimated 65,000 survived. And another 100,000 who were deported to and passed through the Auschwitz camps but didn't receive numbers also survived. So around 165,000. Of the 1.7 to 1.8 million Jews and around 50,000 Roma and an unknown number of Soviet prisoners of war and non-Jews that were killed at the 3 killing centers, Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka, there were relatively few survivors because these camps were not located at labor camps, and they only ever interned several hundred Jewish prisoners at any given time in direct support of the killing process. So of around 900,000 people deported to Treblinka, less than 70 survived until war's end, and most of them escaped during the August 2nd, 1943 uprising. Of around 250,000 deported to Sobibor, only 60 survived, and mostly they escaped during the October 1943 revolt. And of the between 450,000 and 600,000 people deported to Belzec, only 3 survived, which means that of this 1.7 to 1.8 million people, only about 130 people survived until the end of the war. So this means there were many, many fewer witnesses who could testify to these camps. And the radical disproportion between Auschwitz witnesses and these Reinhard witnesses had a total effect on the total pool of testimonies at war's end. Further, at the time of its liberation and dissolution, Auschwitz held a very high ratio of prisoners from Western Europe and Hungary. Many of those were either transported westward in the last weeks of the war via train or through death marches, or they made their way westward immediately after the war. And this higher proportion of Western European Jews among the survivors meant that many of their memoirs appeared in French, German, other Western European languages. They were translated and read widely within the West. And that contributed to this establishment of Auschwitz as that sort of master or narrative or the central killing center. The few survivors of the Reinhard camps were mostly Polish Jews, many of whom spoke Yiddish as their native language. They often spent the remainder of the war in hiding in Poland. After the war, they mostly initially remained behind the Iron Curtain. Their testimonies, when they were published at all, were published chiefly in Polish and Yiddish, but were very rarely circulated in the West. The few testimonies and memoirs that we do have that have been published were published more recently in the last several decades. And many of the survivors emigrated to early Israel, which really discouraged Yiddish publications in the early years. So there were many fewer published accounts circulating of the Reinhard camps than there were of the Auschwitz experience. So we have this kind of interrelated set of factors. On the one hand, this disproportionate number of survivors of Auschwitz as opposed to the Reinhard camps, and then the relative prominence of the Auschwitz narrative in comparison to the obscurity of the Reinhard narrative. And then finally, I know I'm just about out of time, but I just want to mention that also another factor is this campsites themselves. Auschwitz, along with well-known camps in Germany, such as Dachau and Buchenwald, were liberated by the Allied armies. These encounters with the camps were filmed or photographed by the liberating armies, and they entered into the public memory as sites of recent liberation. And then they were mostly changed into memorials that we can visit today. The Reinhard camps, on the other hand, were closed and dismantled in 1943 by the German forces themselves. They were completely razed. There were no barracks, no structures left, nearly a year before the Soviet army even reached that area in which they were located. And so there was little, at the war's end, there was almost nothing to constitute an actual encounter with the genocide that happened there. It had really mostly been effaced. And for this reason, the experiences of the Reinhard camps pretty much just fell off the map of Holocaust memory. So I'm going to mute myself now and listen to the others.
Thank you, Erin. And I'll just very quickly introduce Sven-Erik. So Sven-Erik Rose is the Associate Professor of German and Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Davis. Works on German literature since 1750 and particularly on Yiddish literature and culture and also Holocaust studies. And Sven-Erik is currently writing a book by Jews confined to Nazi ghettos and Holocaust survivor testimony, collecting the immediate aftermath of World War II. So if I could pass to you now, Sven-Erik, for your contribution.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Maybe try to make it.
Yes, I will. Let me see. View full screen slideshow. How about that? Okay, great. Thank you so much. I want to thank the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center for hosting us, and Dion Otosaka for all your organizational work. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with my co-panelists, Sandra, Erin, and Stuart. As Stuart mentioned, I am indeed, I've actually, I think, knock on wood, finished a book that should be coming out this summer in July on, well, it's called, this is the cover, Making and Unmaking Literature in the Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna Ghettos. And so that's what I've been really focusing on for the better part of a decade. And my contribution to the Cambridge History of Holocaust Literature is largely drawing on the research that I've been doing, and with some new materials as well that don't appear in the book. So I want to talk about that, and I will mention other issues that are of concern to the Roundtable about canonicity, and also how this body of work reshapes our thinking of the Holocaust writ large, not only of the canon of Holocaust literature. I'll talk about this more obliquely, and we can come back to them head on in the Q&A. Almost all of the, well, actually all of the text that I write about in the first 2/3 of my book, which has about 9 chapters. I'll get to the table of contents later if you're interested, but were preserved in what is known as the Oyneg Shabbos archive, or the Emanuel Ringelblum archive. Emanuel Ringelblum, as many of you will know, was a Polish Jewish historian who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and even before the ghetto was established, began assembling a team to document what was happening. And eventually, with ghettoization, they focused on what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, but also people that were deported into the ghetto. They took testimony about what happened in their towns, their Stadtlach, and so on. And we're trying to get as many diverse voices as possible, religious, secular, men and women, old and young, different political parties, trying to really get a full sense of the historical record, so that it wouldn't be written only by Nazis, God forbid. And so they buried this archive in two caches. The first was in these biscuit tins of which you see 3 of 9 in this image. And the other two, the second cache was buried in the milk cans, which have become sort of a minor icon, I think, of the Holocaust. One of them is on permanent loan to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And these caches were resurrected, unearthed in 1946, 1950, respectively. A third cache was buried but never recovered. And this is obviously a somewhat staged photograph of recovering the first cache. And this is Hirsch Wasser and Rachel Auerbach, 2 of only 3 members of the UNEXHABA staff who knew where the documents were buried and who survived the war. Auerbach survived with false identity papers on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw, and Hirsch Wasser dramatically leapt from a train bound to Treblinka, one of the killing centers that Erin has just talked about, which is where the most of the people in the Warsaw Ghetto were murdered. Here's another picture of them. And without their, so it's really, one has to remember that it's quite remarkable that we even have these documents. It's entirely plausible that they would just be lost beneath Warsaw and we wouldn't have them. Here's a picture of the team at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which is the permanent home of these documents. In late 50, this cache with the milk cans was unearthed in December 1950. So it's late 50 or early 51. They're sorting through what they found. If you're interested, there's a nice and readily available anthology of texts from the UNEXHABA archive, and some others that are not in that archive, but from the Warsaw Ghetto, edited by David Roskis and a forward by Sam Kassow, called Voices from the Warsaw Ghetto. So I just wanted to mention, if you're interested, that is easy to obtain. So I want to talk about what literature meant to people in ghettos, not only in Warsaw, but let's start there. So Ringelblum writes in his own, took extensive notes, and these are published as in English as notes from the Warsaw Ghetto. And he's writing in June 1942, and as Erin said, this was the most intensive time of killing when and the Warsaw Ghetto was contributing heavily to that intensive murder, when they were just murdering hundreds of thousands of people that were in that ghetto. And so he's writing this within weeks of the beginning of the Great Deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto. So really at the end of the main existence of the ghetto. And he writes, what are people reading? This is still important to him. This is a subject of general interest. After the war, it will intrigue the world. What the world will ask, did people think of on Musa Dagh? That's the place in the Levant or Turkey, where the major site of the Armenian genocide, or in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he says, people who knew for certainty that death would no more skip over them than it had over other large Jewish settlements and small towns like Lublin and many other places that had already been decimated. And he says, let it be said that though we have been sentenced to death and know it, we have not lost our human features. Our minds are as active as they were before the war. The serious Jewish reader, so on, goes on and talks about what they're reading, including novels. So not only belles lettres, literature in the narrower sense of literature, but very much including that. This was a mark of retaining human status, despite in the face of murder, in the face of genocide, and knowing that one would not survive, but still having defining oneself in human terms through a relationship to intellectual and cultural work and thought. So it's a very important status that literature had. And I want to continue on this vein also about what writing meant to people in the ghetto. So Emanuel Ringelblum wrote an overview of what the archival project had all been about, and it was buried in the archive, and it's sort of an essay that gives an overview of what's in the archive and what the aspirations of the archive were. And in that essay, Oinig Shabbos, that's also included in that anthology that I showed you, he writes, the Germans did not care what the Jews did in their own homes. So the Jews began to write. Everyone wrote. Journalists, writers, teachers, community activists, young people, even children. The majority wrote diaries in which daily events and so on. A great deal was written, but the largest part by far was destroyed along with their authors, and all that remained was preserved in this Oinig Shabbos archive. But the fact that everyone was writing mostly diaries, but which is in itself a kind of a literary genre, but also writing more traditional literary genres, like especially poems, but short stories and even one novel was written. This is also very significant. And you'll see an example from the Lodz or Łódź ghetto. Chava Rosenfarb survived the Lodz ghetto. I use the Yiddish pronunciation, Lodz. And she survived and went on to become a major Yiddish poet and especially Yiddish novelist. She wrote the mammoth first novel written in Yiddish about the Holocaust called The Tree of Life, or Der Baum von Leben. And she says, even children and old people were infected with the literary bug. In the ghetto, along with tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery, there raged the epidemic of writing. The drive to write was as strong as the hunger for food. It subdued the hunger for food. Each writer nurtured the hope that his or her voice would be heard. It was a drive to raise oneself above fear through the magical power of the written word, and so to demonstrate one's enduring capacity for love, for singing praise to life. Even in the concentration camps, even by the glare of the crematorium flames, there were those who wrote. So it's hard to overstate the importance that writing had for people during the Holocaust in the ghettos and also in camps. One more example from the Vilna ghetto, Hermann Kruk was actually from the Warsaw ghetto. He was a socialist, a Bundist librarian. He headed up the Grosser Library, the major, the most umfangreich, I want to say, most extensive Bundes library, Yiddish workers library in Warsaw of some 30,000 works on the eve of the Second World War. But he went to Vilna and kept an important diary there, and also headed up the Vilna Ghetto Library, which was compiled out of ransacked libraries in Vilna, which was a cultural center, and also from the orphan books of the many tens of thousands of people who were murdered by a machine gun in the Ponar Woods outside of Vilna. His diary is available from the Yale University Press, The Last Days of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, which was the name of that Vilna had in the Jewish community. And he did a report with his staff and of the first year of activity in the Vilna Ghetto Library, and made really a rather elaborate charts that what are done. You can imagine the sort of primitive tools they had at their disposal. But he writes, and I won't go through everything, but in the books drawn, these are the languages done and used, and mostly Polish, the red, and some quite a bit Yiddish, and then Russian and other languages. Here in the book chart, you see the large book, almost 80% is actually literature, is belles lettres, belletristic. And then another almost 18% is children's literature, that's the red book, and then the small book is scientific literature. So the fact that there is this concern with libraries and what people are reading, and they expend the energy to do a report in the Vilna Ghetto, also is an index. And there are many, many other indices of the importance of the written word, both writing, and reading. And the last slide I'll show you is the image from the cover of my book. And this is a poem by Shmuel Marvel called The Goss, or The Street, which was written, it's about the winter of 41-42, in a very dire time of course, everything gets more dire the longer ghettos go on, but very dire in its own right, with people dying in the thousands every month of starvation, of cold, of disease. And he writes a poem, and this is the last page, and it was damaged in its time underground in the archive. So we don't actually know exactly what it says, but to give you an example of just how outside the canon, even very remarkable, significant poems like this, this body of work is sort of peripheral to the canon. this is the only way to read this poem in Yiddish. It's never been published, to my knowledge, in any Yiddish anthology. If you want the original, you've got to read this handwritten document. It may be Marvel's hand, it might be a copyist hand. It's impossible to tell, I think. It is translated. Sarah Traister Moskowitz did a labor of love and translated all the poetry from the Oyneg Shabbos archive. And that's on her website called Poetry in Hell. If you just Google that, you can get her translations of everything. But there's no book form that collects it all. And this is the only image. I apologize for I accidentally did some scribbling. I don't know how to erase it. So this is the table of contents of my book. I'll just leave it up as I say a couple of concluding words. I'm not sure how I am on time, but just very quickly. I think that a lot of the main historiography of the Holocaust has been very perpetrator centered. A lot of work has been done in the last decade and even more that is beginning to really focus on victims' experience, victims' voices. But I think that in general, the kind of historiography of the Holocaust has either neglected victims' voices almost completely or has looked at writings by victims as documents that kind of corroborate some kind of historical fact, and you see it reflected in the work. And it creates a kind of what I would really argue is a false dichotomy between sort of real history and then literature, which is sort of the vagaries of literary representation versus getting the real facts. But I think that if I've hopefully have helped you see that literature had even a sort of positivistic factual existence in the minds of the Holocaust, the victims of the Holocaust, right? One of the things that was going on during the Holocaust was that people were thinking and remained active thinkers. They had a rich cultural life, they had a rich intellectual life, they had a rich reflection on what was going on, and represented it often quite brilliantly and thoughtfully. And reflected on the status of culture from their perspective in ghettos, being ostracized, being on really the periphery of the human community, pushed to the very edge and excluded in many ways from it. And they thought through this humanistic discourse of literature. I can return to how they thought of literature as a humanistic discourse. So I think that that's one of the main ways that it breaks down or reshapes the way that we understand the Holocaust. We see people not simply as victims of actions by their murderers, but actually as living, thinking people that we need to think with, just both as an ethical obligation, I think, to think with these people, but also intellectual obligation to understand what was the life of Holocaust victims. So I will stop there, and there's of course much more to say in the Q&A, but I don't want to go too much over time. So thank you.
Thanks, Sven-Erik. That's really interesting. Thank you very much. So we now move to Sandra Alfers, who is a professor of German and director of the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University in the US. And Sandra's research focuses very much on the literature of the Holocaust, and particularly on German language poetry written to Asienstadt between 1941 and 1945. And her most recent book is on the Holocaust survivor Elsa Dormitzer, which appeared just last year in 2024. So Sandra, over to you now for your contribution.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Good morning from the Pacific Northwest. Thank you to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and all co-sponsors for organizing this event. And thanks as well to the online audience, to you for taking the time to be with us. Shirley, if you wanted to start sharing the PowerPoint, that would be great. And we can start from the first slide. Wonderful. Like my colleagues, I would like to take the next few minutes to provide some context for the chapter that I prepared for the volume. It focuses on the role that German language literature and poetry played in the Manes group in the Theresienstadt ghetto between 1942 and 1944. The Manes group was a cultural organization led by Philipp Manes, who organized 500 events in the ghetto, including a lecture series, entertainment evenings, recitals, staged readings, and poetry competitions that brought together the German-speaking communities of the ghetto. I will touch on just a few topics which we can expand on in the discussion afterwards. First, I will provide a very short introduction to the ghetto. Then I will give some biographical background on Philipp Mannes and how his writings survived the Holocaust. And then lastly, I will briefly sketch his use of literature and poetry in Theresienstadt. Next slide, please. Let's start with some maps to orient ourselves visually. It is worth remembering that the Nazis and their allies, and I quote here, established more than 44,000 camps, ghettos, and other incarceration sites between 1933 and 1945. The sheer number, more than 44,000, is often hard to grasp. Let's try to visualize this enormity just a bit. On the left, for example, you see a map indicating the major camps just in Greater Germany alone in 1944. And on the right, you see the ghettos in occupied Europe that existed between 1939 and 1944. Theresienstadt, was one of these ghettos. Next slide, please, Shirley. The table on the left provides additional information about the different types of camps and ghettos that existed. And Erin and Sven-Erik already talked about this. I encourage you to use or to check out these websites to learn more just about the different camps. So why do I bring this up? I bring it up because it shows that when we talk about camp literature, we are looking at a very diversified body of writing, composed in many different languages and in very different places and contexts, and of course, by people from varying backgrounds. It affects what and how texts were produced and by whom. More than 140,000 women, children, and men from across Europe were deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto, located about 37 miles northwest of Prague, the largest group being 74,000 Jews from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, followed in numbers by 42,000 German and 15,000 Austrian Jews. With representation from the Netherlands, Slovakia, Denmark, Hungary, and the Sudeten area, the ghetto became a multilingual and multinational space dominated linguistically and culturally by Czech and German-speaking groups, the latter primarily consisting of deportees aged 65 and older. The ghetto served different functions at different times, including Nazi propaganda purposes. 35,000 people died in Theresienstadt between 1941 and 1945, and the SS deported more than 88,000 people and 63 transfers to the killing centers and other murder sites in the East. Next slide, please. My work explores the Shoah through the lens of individual victim testimonies. I'm interested in learning how people in Theresienstadt used literature and poetry to cope with and express what they experienced and how they represented the Holocaust in their native language, in this case German, which we of course consider to be the language of the perpetrators. The person I became particularly interested in when doing research for this project was Philipp Mannes from Berlin, pictured here with his wife Gertrud in 1939. Mannes, a successful businessman and decorated World War I veteran, was an avid writer, chronicling much of his life, and this continued after the couple's deportation in the summer of 1942. He was 68 at the time. Between March and October 1944, Mannes filled 9 notebooks with personal reflections and information on life in the ghetto. In the summer of the same year, he compiled 3 additional memory albums with contributions from fellow prisoners, including drawings, poems, and notes of appreciation for the intellectual nourishment, or in German, geistige Nahrung, the talks, readings, and recitals provided. Philipp Mannes and his wife Gertrud did not survive, but his manuscripts did. A day before their deportation to Auschwitz on October 28, 1944, Mannes passed his materials on for safekeeping to a friend of a friend, Lies Klemmich, who hid them under her mattress until liberation in May 1945. Following a 3-year journey across post-war Europe, the manuscripts finally arrived in London, where Mannes' daughter Eva sought publication through Dr. Alfred Wiener, the founder and director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, pictured here on the right. But he did not succeed. In 1995, Eva Mannes deposited them in the library, where the notebook started to be edited for publication by a team led by Ben Barkow and Klaus Leist, resulting in a German language publication with Ullstein in 2005 and an English language edition with Palgrave Macmillan in 2009. Next slide, please. Today, when we think of the ghetto and its artistic productions, we mostly think of the musical, theatrical, and visual representations, often as examples of spiritual resistance. We pay less attention to the role books and literature played, how and what literature circulated among groups, and how its reception in turn influenced literary production. Manes considered books to be vitamins, essential to his and others' intellectual nourishment. In contrast to food, though, books, perhaps surprisingly, were readily available for consumption, arriving with the deportees and leaving with them on transports to the east. Artwork from Terezin depicts examples of private reading and writing, be it outside on a warm day or indoors in the semi-privacy of barracks and bunk beds. Next slide, please, Shirley. Particularly the elderly and sick benefited from an initiative of the Ghetto Library, which circulated traveling book boxes, so-called Wanderbibliotheken, containing about 30 volumes each that the library staff rotated between barracks, houses, and hospitals. It turns out that fiction was particularly popular, but underrepresented in the library's holdings. Readers would visit different locales in the ghettos, often reading to the elderly and sick, sometimes even being rewarded with precious commodities like food. For example, Else Dormitzer wrote that hunger was so prevalent that she had lost all fear of being infected in the tuberculosis ward, gladly accepting food from the sick as a reward for her readings. Created on November 17, 1942, and led by Prague-born philosopher and psychologist Emil Utitz and his staff, the library grew exponentially during its 2.5 years of existence, carrying anywhere between 160,000 and 200,000 volumes by the end of the war. Manes worked closely with Utitz and Hugo Friedmann from Vienna, who was on the library staff, to secure materials for the 116 staged readings he organized. And Utitz also served as judge for the poetry competitions. Let me close my presentation. Last slide, please. Manes's manuscripts illustrate the manifold uses of literature and poetry and the value fellow prisoners assigned them. He understood literature to be a unifying force across differences, and he created a literary community for German language speakers, regardless of their national and ethnic backgrounds. He intentionally looked for canonical texts for his staged readings and recitals, texts steeped in aesthetic ideals and moral values, drawing on a shared European humanistic tradition. Manes encouraged fellow prisoners to engage in literary activities themselves, from participating in staged readings to writing their own poetry. Poetry proved to be particularly practical for expressing the everyday, even though it seems elusive or even elitist to many today. The genre's clear, versified structure and ability to hold language in a condensed space, often accompanied by simple rhymes, allowed prisoners of all ages and artistic abilities, poet or not, to engage on paper or in the mind. Not surprisingly, Manes also valued original poetry that reflected traditional aesthetic ideals, but he also saw the text's testimonial and emotional values in coping with trauma. Recognizing that reading, listening, and writing helped ordinary people negotiate between the everyday and the extreme, Manes dedicated his time to making available what helped him. Literature provided stability, support, and respite in a world turned upside down. His strategy resonated deeply with fellow inmates who valued, and I quote from his memorial albums, the intellectual nourishment, stimulation, variety, and distraction without which life in Theresienstadt would have been a mere vegetative state. Put simply, and I end with another quote from the memorial album by Al Cohen, the hours spent with the Manes group were an oasis in the desert. Thank you. And thanks, Shirley. I'm done.
Thank you, Sandra, very much for that contribution. I'm going to move us straight into a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves and then open it out to the audience. So probably about 7 or 8 minutes of discussion amongst ourselves, and then perhaps 10, 15 minutes towards the end if people want to have questions prepared for our three speakers. And my first question really is a two-part question. You've all, three of you, in one way or another, talked about the diversity of geographies of the Holocaust. So, you know, against the Auschwitz paradigm, I guess. The first part of my question is, could you say a little bit more about how focusing on those diverse geographies changes our view of the Holocaust itself? And then the second part of the question is, how does literature from those different geographies contribute to changing that picture of the Holocaust? So really it's teasing out some of the questions that the three of you raised during your discussion. Anyone like to start in response to that, or is that just too big a question to open with?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, Sven-Erik, do you want to come in first? And then I think,
Sure.
Erin, you were marginally slower, I think. But...
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I would say, I mean, I think Erin spoke well of the importance of translation into Western languages in order to become canonical, right? So even when you had Elie Wiesel, who certainly, you know, wrote originally in Yiddish, but it wasn't until he rewrote and significantly rewrote his Yiddish testimony in French that it then became widely read, widely translated, and a canonical sort of cornerstone of Holocaust literature. So that's a huge part of it. So if you think of I think also that, and Erin also spoke of Auschwitz as the kind of yardstick for the Holocaust experience, but I think also the death camp in general, and certainly Auschwitz as the overwhelmingly privileged kind of, or if that's the right word, but I mean the most sort of seen death camp. But you know, the ghettos in general are neglected vis-a-vis, I think, death camps, and so actually almost everyone who went to a death camp was at some point in a ghetto and spent more time. And generally, people didn't spend much time in death camps. They went there and got killed. That was the by far sort of typical experience and very rare experience, and only in Auschwitz, say, as opposed to the three Reinhardt Operation Reinhardt centers where you didn't spend much time. You went there and got murdered. That's basically what they were for and what they did terrifyingly well. So studying the ghettos that's a place where a lot of culture was produced. It's sort of eerie to think of these as very culturally rich places and places of Jewish cultural production, but they absolutely were. And so I think focusing on them does really sort of recalibrate what we look at when we look at Holocaust literature. And I would say there are two things I would want to really emphasize, and one is the question of language, that people wrote in Yiddish and in Polish, and as Erin said, those were much less likely to kind of reach wider audiences. But not only language, but also the cultural sort of coordinates of those cultures. These were people in Eastern Europe that people had a culture, and it was a Jewish culture, and you know, Benjamin Harshov, a scholar of literature, Hebrew and Yiddish, and also a linguist, wrote of two Holocausts. One, the sort of biological eradication of the Jewish people in Europe, and another, cultural genocide. And cultural genocide is devastatingly effective. And I think it really left Yiddish culture, which was always didn't have a state behind it, didn't have a lot of wealth behind it, didn't have a lot of, you know, kind of institutional wherewithal. It had, you know, some had the YIVO and different things, but it was really, by definition, devastated by the cultural genocide, and in no place to sort of dictate the terms of cultural memory. So it's a terrible, terrible irony, but I'll finish with this, that the reason why it's so easy to neglect the huge, really, corpus of Yiddish writing from the Holocaust is because the Holocaust happened. So you know, if it hadn't happened, I think Yiddish speakers and Yiddish culture would be in a much better place to advocate for itself. But because cultural genocide and genocide in general is so effective, it leaves its victims unable to really be heard. So that it's a terrible, terrible conundrum that I think we still haven't really done a full reckoning with, or even begun to reckon with almost, is just the absolute peripheralization of what one could imagine a world in which that would be absolutely central, right? In which if you didn't have some kind of chops in Yiddish, you just couldn't be a Holocaust studies person. If the Holocaust was sort of played out in German or Spanish or French, and you couldn't read a single line of those languages, you just wouldn't be in the field. And that, I'm not casting aspersions, I'm just saying that one could imagine that being the case. And it's not the case because cultural genocide is so effective. And I think we just have to kind of continue to weigh that all in there.
Thank you. Erin, yeah.
Yeah, I actually wanted, what I have to say is a little bit similar to what Sven-Erik is saying, and that is, you know, we have this canon of Holocaust literature that's developed, this transnational canon, which our volume is trying to kind of get a grasp on. And I've become increasingly aware the ways in which that is a very incomplete and biased canon, in that it relies first of all, for its grounding and its authority in the survivor testimony of the survivor memoir, which became the gold standard for Holocaust literature for many decades. And it's what we often teach in the class. I started my own class this semester with Primo Levi, right? It's a brilliant piece of writing, but it is this tiny peephole into a world that's behind it. And I think that what Sven-Erik and Sandra are showing is that, first of all, it does not grapple with the culture and the literature produced during the Holocaust. And that has only in pieces been included in wide ways in the canon. Certainly Anne Frank's memoir being one of them, right? Her diary, that she wrote that during the Holocaust. We do read that, but mostly that production during the Holocaust has not been the foundation of Holocaust literature in the way that the survivor's memoir has been. But what that does, and this is sort of where I'm going with my contribution, is that memoir can only, it has its own historical context and how it was able to develop. And that means that survivors were there to write that memoir or to give their testimony. And what we know is that parts of Europe produced survivors, and other parts of Europe or other contexts in Europe produced no survivors, or very few survivors. We have few survivors of mass shootings. We have what we have, and Sue Weiss, who's here, has written about this. What we have is a literature that gestures toward the experience of mass shootings, but cannot tell it from the inside in the way that the survivor's memoir of Auschwitz can tell it from the inside. And that's also the problem really with the Reinhard camps. We have very few published memoirs that can tell us the experience of those camps. My contribution is really looking at contemporary fiction that's trying to fill this gap of imagination, because we simply don't have the literary production around these camps in the sheer amount we have for Auschwitz, for Dachau, for Buchenwald, for Bergen-Belsen, etc. And that means that the literature itself is uneven. The canon is extremely uneven and asymmetrical with regard to the actual experience of the Holocaust.
Thanks, Erin. Sandra, do you want to make a comment as well?
Just briefly, I appreciated the idea of the master narratives that were circulated by Sven-Erik and Erin. And I think, to your question, Stuart, that's really something that we can peel back the layers of these different narratives in its plurality that existed. So that's the opportunity, I think, that when we can look really on a micro level at these different kinds of camps and ghettos and what happened there, and really find out differences where a certain group might have reacted differently and for different purposes than another group. But then when we take it to the macro level and sort of this transnational level, that when we think about Holocaust literature, we can pick out similarities and differences. And I think it really allows us to have a broader and a deeper understanding of some of these narratives that were created in the post-war areas in different places and national contexts. I think just as an add-on here to what Sven-Erik and Erin described.
Thanks, Sandra. So we've had a couple of questions posted in the chat, so I'm just going to voice them if that's okay. So one question is around Ladino. So we've talked a little about Yiddish. Can we maybe make a quick comment on Ladino? And the second question is around the importance of remembering the people. So you talked, Sandra, about manners, and you made a comment at the beginning of your talk about the importance of the individuals involved. So could we have a quick comment on Ladino and then a quick comment on the importance of the people who are the center of the actual writing, if that's possible, please?
I don't know if Sven-Erik or Sandra, you wanted to comment on Ladino. I'm definitely not an expert on Ladino, one of the two major Jewish languages in the Holocaust. I mean, Hebrew being another. You know what? Ladino is also a language that was spoken in southeastern Europe. That is generally those communities. They're not gone, but the eradication of the communities mirrors what Sven-Erik is talking about with regard to the Yiddish-speaking community. So I think Ladino is in a similar situation to what Sven-Erik talked about with regard to cultural genocide. But I'd also argue that we have a Southeastern Europe in general is neglected in the study, the canon of Holocaust literature that we know, especially in the English-speaking world. And a number of contributors in our volume are really interested in that part. I mean, it's neglected in Holocaust historiography, and it's neglected in the canon. And I think Ladino, Romanian, Hungarian, Syro-Croatian, a number of languages are often not represented in the way that you have with regard to, again, French, German, etc.
And I think to add to that, I don't think there's a big corpus in Ladino, is there, Erin? I think there's some poetry that we're aware of. There's not a huge corpus, but it does get reflected through other authors in other languages. So I'm thinking about Canetti in German, who's a Sephardic Jewish author, and talks about Ladino and the importance of Ladino and his background, but I don't think the corpus is big, is it? The second question, Sandra and Sven-Erik, do you want to say a little bit more about the people involved and the importance of the literature is the literature, but there's also people behind the literature?
Absolutely. And I think, Tali, thank you so much for that question. That is precisely the point about this Manis books, the notebooks that were hidden for so long and that survived in the archives and that only belatedly came to light. And it's really quite amazing. The memorial albums were integrated into parts of the publication. But if you look at the original manuscripts, you see the sheer amount of people who are responding, who are reacting, who are thankful and grateful for this opportunity to engage with each other through literature, through poetry, through evening recitals, what have you. So absolutely. And I think that's the point that we're trying to make, is that ordinary people wrote these texts. And the idea of the Holocaust literature as a canonized project, it has prioritized, and particularly in a West German context, if I come from German studies and this idea, there are these iconic writers that we think of that were, of course, wonderful writers, but it's not the whole story. The whole story is that people wrote across ghettos. I was struck also with Sven-Erik's comment too, that Chava Rosenfarb made about, this being an illness. Precisely the same thing was said by H.G. Adler in Theresienstadt, who didn't know what was going on because people were so involved in writing poetry. And the only way to assess this kind of poetry was this aesthetic framework. And there are other frameworks. And Mann is interesting in that regard because he was not a literary scholar. He was an ordinary person who valued literature, and he saw this very practical use of literature, and he saw a testimonial value already in the ghetto. He wanted to preserve the literature, and he wanted to preserve the poetry. So and bring about the story of the people who wrote these poems. And of course, he didn't survive. And not of course, but he didn't survive. The manuscripts did. And the edits or the editions are also very interesting in sort of seeing like how different people are coming to light, how ordinary people are coming to light in his notebooks. So I think, yes, that's very, very important. And I'm very glad you're bringing this up.
Yeah, I would add to that only that I think that the writings and the people behind them are just so fused, and you know, I think it's very easy in a very, you know, regrettable way to, when we think of just the sheer numbers of millions of people murdered, it's very hard to think of them as fully human individual people, right? I mean, you see pictures of these emaciated corpses, and so many didn't even have that bodily form left, were literally reduced to ashes. And so when you read what people wrote, you have this, you know, you are amazed by just the intellectual wealth and the emotional wealth, but just the absolute reflection on what's going on. You see a fully engaged human mind, right, and thinking in the worst possible circumstances and continuing to think. So I think if you want to honor the person, I think one of the best ways is to read their work, right? And you really, and then you can extrapolate from that it's also the people who wrote and their writings were gone, or people who didn't have a chance to write, were also similarly fully human people. So I think that there's certainly not a dichotomy between the work and the person. You know, I think that they are absolutely complement each other wonderfully, and I think in a really important way.
Thank you. And just one final question. This comes from Lisa Peschel, who many of you will know has written on Theresienstadt and drama in Theresienstadt. And it's really leads on from that last question, that last discussion about the contrast between literature as a form of escapism, which some of you have touched on a little bit, and literature as a form of engagement, as a way of, you know, resisting or documenting the experience. And I wanted to say a little bit about that. Not necessarily a tension, but difference, I guess, between the two.
I have some thoughts on that. That's something that people actually wrote about explicitly, like Hermann Kruk, the guy who did the Vilna Ghetto library. He was a real Yiddishist and a Bundist, and was sort of dismayed that too many the youth were all reading sort of trashy literature in Polish rather than the classics in Yiddish. So there was that. I want to come back to that in a moment to complicate it a little bit. But he also said there were some people that are reading the serious, and also Ringelblum used that term, the serious Jewish reader, right, is looking for analogies and reading about like Verfel's account of the Armenian genocide and different sort of Tolstoy War and Peace. So when they're reading about war and reading about the First World War and trying to look for sort of a desperate search for analogies to their situation and thinking through what it is that they're dealing with. So that was kind of a serious way to read literature. And then there's kind of an escapist way to read literature. But even Kruk, who was very, very, you know, dismayed at reading these trashy detective novels in Polish translation, he himself, and this is one of my chapters I write mostly on this, wrote an account of a sort of a true crime narrative. There was a murder case in the Vilna Ghetto, and that was tried by the Judenrat and Jewish police, and it's a very infamous kind of, well, I don't know about infamous, but a very complex, morally complex case. And he wrote it in terms of a Sherlock Holmes story, and he uses that term many times. And so it's possible for him, and I think for others, to also read what we consider maybe lowbrow or middlebrow literature in a very, you know, thoughtful kind of way. And so, and far be it from me to criticize anyone who's trying to escape, you know, daily life in a ghetto by reading some literature. You know, it's like I try to escape my own life, which is nothing compared to nothing like, you know, I have a wonderful life, and I still want to escape sometimes in literature. So I think all of the above. You know, I think literature was doing all of the things that literature does, you know, in whiling away time and escapism, but also a way to think through one's situation. One of the things that literary writers are doing is sort of comparing genres in a very meta-reflective way. That's something that I really focus on in my book. A very kind of self-conscious reflection on the status of literary genres and how adequate they are to the circumstances in which they are writing. Can you write a detective story in the Vilna Ghetto? Can you write a novel? Is it possible? Does what you're trying to novelize add up to a novel, and so on and so forth? Can you write a lyric poem about death in the Warsaw ghetto streets? It's very explicit. Like, is this a poem kind of thing? Is this a short story? How does it relate to European traditions and Jewish traditions? Are we at the edge of what literature can do? So literature as a sort of humanizing, humanistic sort of discourse was at issue was always, what is our human status in these really dehumanizing conditions? So I think literature did all of those things, and I'll just add in there.
Thank you very much. Erin and Sandra, would you like to make a comment on that as well?
I mean, that's not really, I'll let Sandra go for that here.
Okay, the one point I wanted to bring up or come back to Lisa's questions, thank you for that, is sort of the engagement part, because I think that's important to remember, because it ties nicely to Tally's question about the people behind this. And I think what I tried to allude to in my presentation and what is important is to remember that poetry became a very practical means for people in different contexts. So it allowed really people to focus on creating something in their head if they didn't have writing materials available, which was also the case, or on paper. And it helped them. And this is what Manis's albums tell us. And this is what, for example, what can be found in Ruth Klüger, Gerti Spies, and other writings about the literature and the idea of creating poetry, is that it really helped to express the experience. It really helped you cope with what was going on. It helped you to not lose your mind. That's what Klüger wrote about, to kind of stay sane. And that structured, regular form provided the stability that was needed. So I think this personal engagement had a psychological effect as well. So it was not only an escapism, but it was on the one side, we have, reading literature perhaps as a way of staying focused, but then writing poetry in particular as a way of keeping yourself in a sane state of mind to pass time. And there's so many different reactions that we can't describe in total, but in particular with Theresienstadt, I think that's very important to keep in mind. So that stability that was provided through the genre. Erin, I'll end.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to say to that particular, given that that's not the focus of my contribution.
Great. I think we're at time, so I'm just going to thank our three speakers and thank Tali and Shirley and everyone else at the Centre for hosting us. Deanne, who has worked tirelessly, one of our postdoctoral fellows, who's worked tirelessly over the last couple of months to put this all together, and a whole programme of events happening in different centres around the world. So please do go to our website and find out about those as well. And to our three speakers, thank you for such great contributions and for a great discussion afterwards. And we will see each other soon, I hope.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night,
Bye.
everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.